Hello everyone, welcome back. My name is Daira from Gumpia Designs and Creations, and today we will be learning what are gauge swatches in crochet, how to make them, how to read them and count stitches, and how to adjust if needed. Before watching this video, you should at least know how to crochet in rows. I made a video about it and it is linked in the description below, so you can go check it out. Let's get started. Let's begin with what are gauge swatches and what they are used for. A gauge swatch is commonly used when following patterns, specifically patterns worked in rows that involve sizing, like for example, shirts and dresses, and any other garments. It is just a small test piece of crochet fabric used to check whether your crochet tension matches the pattern's requirements. When you make a gauge swatch, you're checking if the number of stitches and rows you crochet in a given area match the measurements specified in the pattern. This given area is usually a square of 4 by 4 inches or 10 by 10 centimeters, and the swatch will probably require the most used stitch in the pattern. So for example, if the pattern uses mostly double crochet stitches, then the gauge swatch will probably ask for it to be made with double crochet stitches as well. Why is it important? Every crocheter is different. A project can have different results between crocheters even if the pattern, the yarn, and the hook size are exactly the same. This is mostly because of tension. Gauge swatches help reduce this difference. Tension is basically how tight or loose you make your stitches, and it varies from person to person. Even though there are tips in terms of helping your hands by avoiding exhaustion or pain, there is really not a right or wrong way with tension. Because of this, we gauge swatch. Gauge swatches are also important when substituting yarn because it helps you make sure you're still within the necessary stitches and sizes even when you're not using the recommended yarn for the pattern. The first thing to do is to check the pattern gauge swatch. It will probably look something like this. Also, if you didn't know, you can also find that yarn labels have a gauge. After you see the pattern requirements, meaning the size of the swatch, the stitch to use on the swatch, the amount of stitches and rows, and the recommended hook size and yarn, you then select the hook and the yarn you are going to use. I say this because this is the moment where you need to decide whether you will be using the recommended yarn and hook size, or if you're substituting the yarn and or choosing another hook size because you may already know how your tension will be. I want to make a small pause here to talk a little bit more about tension. If you have crocheted some projects already and you have noticed that your work ends up being either smaller or bigger than it should, then you probably have an idea of if you crochet tight or loose. If you haven't done projects yet, or if you haven't noticed, then it's better to just start your projects and gauge swatches with the yarn and hook recommended by the pattern you're following. This will give you a good starting point to then adjust accordingly depending on your results, which I will tell you later in this video how to adjust it. After you have chosen your yarn and hook size, you just create your swatch. The swatch should be slightly bigger than the required swatch size because sometimes the swatch could curl at the edges, or maybe your foundation chain ends up being tighter than the fabric itself, among other things. Because of this, it's better to have extra fabric in the swatch so that you have a more accurate reading of it. I will show you what I mean. In the example for this video, I will follow the gauge swatch on this Red Heart Super Saver yarn label. As you can see, this slot right here is the gauge swatch. I will make a future video for understanding yarn labels, but for now, let's just focus on the swatch. Since I will probably end up doing multiple swatches, I will use 2 colors so that you can better differentiate between them. I will also be using multiple hook sizes since changing hooks is the best way to adjust a swatch. The other way would be trying to change your tension, which will probably be a lot more difficult and will take a lot more time getting used to. Think of it as your handwriting. You already have it, and trying to change it will take time and a lot of practice. This gauge is read like this. First, notice that there are 2 gauges in the label, one with a crochet hook and one with knitting needles. Naturally, for crochet, just focus on the one with the hook. In that same inner white square, on the top and bottom of the hook's image, you can see the size of the recommended hook. In this case, it recommends a 5.5mm hook. The bottom number is the US hook size, which is I9. They are both the same hook size, so don't get confused. I got a Pinterest pin with a conversion table for hook sizes, just in case you want to check it out in the description below. On the left and top of the white square, you will see the size of the swatch you need to make and measure. Here it is asking for the regular 4x4 inches or 10x10 centimeters. At the right side, you will see the amount of rows needed. In this case, I should end up with 15 rows within those 4 inches. At the bottom part, you will see the number of stitches required within 4 inches and also the stitch to be used. Here it's asking for 12 stitches, specifically 12 single crochet stitches. So, to summarize, using a 5.5mm hook in an area that measures 4x4 inches, I should have 15 rows with 12 single crochet stitches per row. Easy, right? Here are some other examples of how gauge is specified in written patterns. Okay. So, as the yarn label recommends, I will use a 5.5mm hook, which I know will never work for me, and you will see why. I will start like I normally would when working in rows. If you're watching this video, it probably means that you already know how to work in rows, but if you don't, remember to check the video I mentioned before. I also have my ruler near because we are going to need it. There are also other tools that are specifically for gauge swatches and measurements like these. They do the same thing you can do with a ruler, but it looks more appealing and clearer, and they can be a little handy. After I make my slip knot, I will just make a row of chains. As for the amount, I'll just make chains until I reach a little over 4 inches of length. In this case, I made 16 chains. And that looks about right. Now remember, you can work either on one loop of the chain or the back bumps. I always use the back bumps. I will now make 15 single crochet, working from the second chain from the hook, so all my rows will be of 15 single crochets. Remember that this is my case, but in your case you may need more or fewer stitches to reach the 4 or more inches. And that's my first row. And just to double check, I will use my ruler again to make sure I have more than 4 inches of length, and I have 5, so that's more than enough. It's better to check now when you're just starting than doing it after you have multiple rows to avoid the need of frogging. Again, my rows will be of 15 stitches, which is more than required, but this is on purpose so that I have extra fabric when measuring. Now I just continue making row after row after row until I have the necessary length. The gauge requires 15 rows, so I should make a little bit more than that. Another side note, first try to match the amount of stitches per row and then try to match the amount of rows. Why? Because you only need a couple of rows before checking the amount of stitches. That way you can catch early on any differences that need adjusting, and this avoids making unnecessary rows. Here I have made 8 rows. And like I just said, I will be checking the amount of stitches per row that I have so far. I will flatten my swatch as much as possible, avoiding stretching it and just letting it lay naturally, because stretching it will not make an accurate reading because it will eventually shrink to its natural size and the sizing will be different. Another side note, sometimes the pattern will recommend you block your swatch. Blocking is a finishing technique used to shape and set the fibers of a crochet project after it's completed. This is particularly beneficial for projects like garments because it gives your raw crochet work a nice drape and symmetry. So you would just block the swatch like you will probably end up blocking the pattern you're following. Before I start counting, let me show you how to recognize each stitch and each row in case you don't know how. These right here are the rows. The best way I recognize the rows is by looking at these bow-like shapes. Each row of bows represent 2 single crochet rows. Right now I have a total of 8 rows, keeping in mind that I'm not counting the foundation chain as a row. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. As for the stitches, those same bow-like shapes can be used to recognize single crochet stitches. It will be slightly different for other type of stitches, but in this case, each bow is basically one single crochet stitch on top of another. So counting horizontally, each half of the bow will be one stitch of the row. Going back to my ruler, I will align it to a stitch, which is what I will start counting. In this case, I'm choosing this one. Now I just count the stitches that are between the start of the ruler and the 4-inch mark. Here I have a total of 13 stitches, which already tells me that my tension is tighter than it should for this gauge and that I should change my hook size. With this small swatch of 8 rows, I could also preliminarily check the gauge rows by checking how many are there in 2 inches and then multiplying that number by 2. Either way, you should still make a full swatch once you have the right amount of stitches per row, just to have a more accurate reading. Right here, I aligned the 2-inch mark to one of the rows, and now I will count how many are there. Since this small swatch is also about 2 inches, that means that my number of rows is 8, and 8 multiplied by 2 is 16. My gauge requires 15 rows, so I already have an extra row than I should, and I also have an extra stitch per row. Thanks to this preliminary check, I know I don't have to make the full swatch because it's already wrong for the required gauge, and continuing would be pointless. Okay, so now I know for sure that I have to change my hook. This 5.5mm doesn't work for me, as I predicted. For this next example, I will choose a 4.5mm hook instead, so that you can see the different result that I will get. I will do the same thing, starting with a slip knot and making chains until I get to a little over 4 inches. In this case, I have 17 chains to make rows of 16 single crochet. Again, I will make multiple rows until I have enough to preliminarily check the stitches and rows. I have reached the same point as before, where I have a total of 8 rows. I'm bringing my other swatch to see the differences, and as you can see, the current swatch is slightly smaller than the previous one. But take a look at this. Let's count the stitches. Again, I'll align my ruler to one of the stitches, and I will count until I reach the 4-inch mark. So here I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 stitches. That is the opposite of what I needed. I needed less stitches than the previous swatch, and instead I have more. Let's check the rows in 2 inches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Again, I have 8 rows, which is still one more than it should. This means I should have gone with a bigger hook size instead of a smaller one. I made this so that you can understand better how hook sizes work. The smaller the hook, the more stitches you will have per 4 inches, and the bigger the hook size, the less stitches. Also, because the stitches are tighter, there is less drape in the fabric because it's more condensed. This is why, even though the swatch looks smaller than the previous swatch, it still has more stitches, because it's more compacted. Now that we understand this, I need a hook size bigger than 5.5mm. So in my case, it's either a 6 or a 6.5. In this next example, I used a 6mm hook just to show you. I did exactly the same thing as my first swatch, slip knot, 16 chains, 15 stitches per row, and 8 rows. Here's the result so far. And bringing my first swatch for comparison, I'm already noticing that they are almost the same size, which means it is still probably not the correct gauge. And counting again, I have about 13 stitches in 4 inches instead of 12. And the rows as well are still 8 in 2 inches, which makes it 16 in 4 inches. This means 6.5mm hook is my next try. Same thing, slip knot, 16 chains, 15 stitches, 8 rows. Here's the result. Now let's count. One, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. Finally, I have 12 stitches in 4 inches. Now for the rows. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and a little bit more, so about 7.5, which is perfect for 15 when multiplied by 2. This means that so far, this hook size is the correct one for me and this gauge. Let's compare the first and last swatches. As you can see, the last swatch is bigger but with less stitches in 4 inches. This is the comparison between the 5mm and 6.5mm hook swatches. Again, the 5mm swatch is smaller but with more stitches. And now the 6 and 6.5 hook swatches. And here is just the 6.5mm hook swatch, which is the correct one for me. Now I will continue making rows on that last swatch with my 6.5mm hook until I reach a little over 4 inches tall. This is to make sure that the full gauge is correct. This is my result. Now I will just lay it flat without stretching it and make sure I have the requirements, which, let's remember, is that within 4 inches I should have 15 rows and 12 single crochets per row. And I still have 12 stitches in 4 inches. Also, just to show you with centimeters, it's exactly the same, if not a little bit more accurate. And for the rows, one, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. I have exactly 15 rows in 4 inches. Yay! So, my conclusion is that for this Red Heart Super Saver yarn label gauge, I need to go up a whole hook size to meet the requirements instead of using the recommended 5.5mm hook. Also remember that these failed swatches could be useful for future projects. Just remember to note down the gauge you got on these and even save the swatch itself, because in the future you may encounter a pattern that has one of these gauges and instead of doing the whole swatch again, you may use this. The only reason they would not be as useful is if over time you have changed your tension and your way of crocheting, which is totally normal. If that's the case, then you should definitely make the gauge swatches again. And you may be wondering if gauge swatches are used when working in rounds, and the answer is that they may be used, but are not as common, since most of the projects worked in the rounds don't need specific sizing like garments do. When working on an amigurumi pattern, for example, a slight variation in size usually isn't a concern, since these pieces aren't typically meant to be worn, and most people won't mind. Ultimately, as with anything in crochet, using a gauge swatch in the round depends on both the pattern and the crocheter's approach. And that's it for this video. I hope you found it useful and understood what are gauge swatches and how to use them. Here's a summary of what we learned today, and remember that learning new things in crochet will lead you to be an awesome crochet designer. As always, if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions for future videos, comment them below. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you want to see more content like this, please subscribe. Also, make sure to check out my social media for more content. Happy crocheting! Bye!